Welcome. My name is Michael Weaver, and I'm a legal intern with the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia, here to tell you the 4 things you need to know about the Cambodian National Elections of 2023. First, recent findings and recommendations by the United Nations deserve special attention. Over the past 6 months, several UN agencies and officials at the highest level have issued a series of reports and statements finding, in the clearest of terms, that Hun Sen has poisoned the electoral process. He has made free, fair, and legitimate elections in Cambodia impossible by eliminating the main political opposition party, jailing its leaders in mass criminal trials, closing down the independent media, and destroying civil society's ability to express its views freely. Second, the results of Cambodia's sham election should not be recognized or supported by foreign governments or by the Khmer and international communities. Third, strong economic sanctions, including a tourism and trade boycott, should be imposed, along with other pressures designed to force the Hun Sen government to implement the United Nations Action Plan of reform measures that it found to be necessary before free elections could take place. Fourth, the Khmer community needs to substantially increase and expand its own recent advocacy efforts by using every available international forum and platform to bring truth to power about Hun Sen's human rights and rule of law abuses, starting with the September 23, 2023 UN Human Rights Council's UPR review session on Cambodia. These efforts must continue until meaningful and effective change takes place along the lines the UN has recommended in its Action Plan of Reform measures. In summary, we need to face the sad reality that Hun Sen has solidified his autocratic power by eliminating any meaningful political opposition, as well as by, in the words of the United Nations, destroying civil society's ability to freely express its views and to participate in the political process in an effective way. But the United Nations' recent strong and clear challenges to Hun Sen's repressive abuses, along with the Khmer community's own recent new advocacy efforts, offer a new hope that international efforts promoting meaningful and effective change along the lines proposed by the United Nations is possible. The upcoming September 23rd initiation of the UN Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Review session on Cambodia provides the next opportunity to test the effectiveness of these new international advocacy efforts.
First, my thanks to the Commission on Inquiry for Cambodia for the invitation to join this important session on the July 2023 election. My name is Kian Vesteinsson. I'm a senior research analyst at Freedom House. Freedom House is an independent organization founded in 1941 on the core conviction that freedom flourishes in democratic nations where governments are accountable to their people. Our work is built around 3 pillars: research and analysis on the threats to and opportunities for democracy, advocacy to governments, the private sector, and other powerful actors on how to protect fundamental freedoms, and direct support to frontline activists and human rights defenders around the world. Now, in July 2023, the Cambodian people will take to the polls in an election with an outcome that is near certain: the consolidation of power by the ruling party, and an even greater threat to the human rights of Cambodians. I want to be very clear about the basic realities of this election. Prime Minister Hun Sen has held the premiership since 1985. His Cambodian People's Party holds every seat in the legislature. As of now, Cambodia is de facto a one-party state. The prospect of change to that status quo in the July 2023 election is remote. Freedom House's research has found that Hun Sen and the CPP government have steadily undermined human rights in Cambodia. This decline is pronounced before, during, and after election periods. As such, this session comes at a critical time. It's critical that the international community understand what is at stake for the Cambodian people in the July 2023 elections, and to act accordingly. Now, for an example, Consider the preceding Cambodian general elections in 2018. In the period ahead of voting, the country's shaky democracy effectively collapsed. During and after the 2018 elections, political rights and civil liberties cratered in Cambodia. Freedom House's annual Freedom in the World report ranks Cambodia at 24 out of possible 100 points as of 2023, down from a peak of 32 points in 2016. Much of that decline is due to the steady erosion of the Cambodian people's political rights. Cambodia now ranks among the worst in the world when it comes to electoral processes and political pluralism. That decline has shaped the conditions of the 2023 balloting. Election Watch for the Digital Age is a Freedom House initiative to investigate the interplay between digital platforms and election integrity in key elections around the world. A core component of this project is our Election Vulnerability Index, which evaluates key election-related indicators with the aim of identifying specific areas of concern ahead of a country's election. Cambodia has a score of 29 out of 100, with 100 representing the least vulnerability in terms of election integrity. This score in the Election Vulnerability Index reflects the CPP's erosion of democratic procedures in Cambodia. Now, let me turn to some of the key trends that Freedom House identifies as creating these deeply concerning conditions ahead of the July 2023 election. First, the CPP has strategically and systematically manipulated the conditions under which elections take place in order to favor their own success. In 2018, the CPP won every seat in both chambers in elections that were considered neither free nor fair by established international observers. This is not likely to change in 2023. Hun Sen and the CPP have sought to quash the country's political opposition, particularly since 2013. Ahead of the 2018 election, the Supreme Court banned the main opposition party, the CNRP. In the years that followed, many CNRP leaders were arrested. Now, some Cambodians still bravely seek to participate in the country's elections as a part of independent political parties. In late 2021, opposition politicians revived the Candlelight Party, which had been defunct since its founder Sam Rainsy set it aside to form the CNRP. Now, the Candlelight Party is one of many in a fractured opposition that are set to contest the 2023 election. All signs indicate that the CPP is prepared to destabilize the Candlelight Party. Ahead of the June 2022 commune election, the NEC struck opposition candidates from voting lists, and opposition parties alleged that there was widespread voter suppression, intimidation, and vote rigging. In the aftermath of the 2022 commune elections, the CPP took steps to undermine the opposition even further. The CPP and NEC filed separate defamation charges against Son Chai, vice president of the Candlelight Party, after he criticized the conduct of the election. As of a December 22 appeals court ruling, Son Chai faces a fine of about $1 million to be paid to the CPP, and other Candlelight Party officials have been arrested in suspect circumstances. The second trend Freedom House research has identified is the CPP's year-long campaign against independent Cambodian media. The CPP has eroded media freedom in Cambodia to a breaking point. Since 2017, the government has deployed a variety of tactics, including lawsuits, website blocks, criminal prosecutions, massive tax bills, and occasionally violent attacks to silence Khmer language independent media. Journalists across the country face risk of arrest and harassment for their reporting. A 2021 survey found that a staggering 56% of Cambodian journalists reported experiencing legal harassment because of their work. That is particularly the case for those reporting on the very real harms that Cambodian people face because of government corruption and repression. Ahead of the 2018 elections, the government shuttered the Cambodia Daily and 15 independent radio stations. These media sources were an important line for Cambodian people to access independent views and information untainted by government propaganda. The hammer came down again earlier this year, this time against Voice of Democracy, one of the few remaining independent Cambodian outlets. In February 2023, Hun Sen announced in a Facebook post that the government had revoked the operating license of Voice of Democracy's parent organization. The issue at hand was the outlet's reporting on Hun Minet's role in the government. The Voice of Democracy closure is not unprecedented, but it is something of a landmark. In August 2022, the Cambodia office of the UNOHCHR released an important report on the state of press freedom in the country. The report noted that Cambodia's media is in, quote, a perilous state. That peril is great even now as we speak in the spring, and the months to come before July may bring even further restrictions. Third, the Hun Sen government and the CPP have severely raised the costs for free expression and assembly in Cambodia. Members of the general public and prominent opposition figures alike face the risk of intimidation, arrest, prosecution, and multi-year prison sentences for simply expressing their views on political and social issues. Indeed, the government has launched a years-long campaign to arrest and prosecute former CNRP members for their activities. Mass trials throughout 2021 and 2022 saw dozens of CNRP-affiliated activists sentenced to long prison terms over their opposition activism, including their criticism of the government posted on social media. Take, for example, human rights lawyer and pro-democracy activist Terry Sung. Sung spent decades working to build a strong civil society in Cambodia. She also criticized Hun Sen and the CPP on social media and rallied support for exiled CNRP leader Sam Rainsy. In response, authorities arrested Sung and sentenced her to 6 years imprisonment as a part of a mass trial. Recent attention to the digital sphere also suggests that the Cambodian government is building up its legal and technical infrastructure for further control on free expression and assembly. The most recent draft of the cybercrime law imposes sharp criminal penalties on speech that the government deems adverse. It would also impose new obligations on service providers that may fuel deeper government surveillance. Meanwhile, the authorities appear to be pursuing their plan for a national internet gateway that would centralize all internet traffic in Cambodia under government control. The NIG was imposed by sub-decree in February 2021 and postponed a year later. Though the current status of its implementation is unclear, the NIG system would force service providers to extend government control over online content. As the election approaches, there are promising signs that the international community is alert to the dangers. Professor Vitit Muntarborn, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Cambodia, conducted his first official visit under the UN Special Procedures in August 2022. He met with stakeholders across the landscape of Cambodian politics, from Hun Sen to land rights activists, trade unionists, and other human rights defenders. The Special Rapporteur's end-of-mission statement is significant. He reports that the CPP's course of action since 2017 constitutes, and I quote, systemic control by the powers that be, leading to political and other distortions, undermining the call for a pluralistic democracy. Indeed, the Cambodian people deserve to participate in pluralistic and transparent elections without interference. And that is a remote prospect in 2023. As I've described, the CPP has seriously undermined political rights and civil liberties ahead of the July 2023 election. But authorities can still carry out their baseline obligation to ensure that Cambodians can vote with ease come summer. The Cambodian government should work to ensure that the July balloting takes place smoothly and without direct interference from government officials. Cambodians should be able to discuss the elections, organize in political parties, and participate in the balloting without fear of harassment, intimidation, arrest, and prosecution. Cambodian authorities should also address discriminatory barriers to voting and permit the presence of independent election monitors. But these baseline efforts alone are simply not enough to make this election free and fair. It is crucial that the international community understand the risks that the election presents for Cambodians and their enjoyment of their human rights. Before, during, and after the election, governments and policymakers around the world should work to support the Cambodian people. Governments should direct funding towards programs that strengthen democracy in Cambodia, particularly at critical junctures like elections. Democracies should also work to support Cambodia's independent media, including media outlets operating in exile. Voice of Democracy is only the latest independent outlet to be shuttered by the Cambodia government, and it will not be the last. Democracies can provide media outlets with financial assistance and innovative financing models, as well as technical support, skills training, and mentorship. They should also expand protections for journalists who faced physical attacks and harassment, including by supporting the creation of emergency visas for those at risk, as well as these technologies to circumvent censorship and evade surveillance. It's also critical that democratic governments engage in public campaigns to raise the awareness of political prisoners in Cambodia and lobby for their release. Now, companies that operate or provide services in Cambodia should also be prepared to support Cambodians facing repression during the election period. Much is at stake here for the Cambodian people in the July 2023 election. And it's deeply important that the international community, from democratic governments to private companies, be prepared to respond.
A key element of this process that needs to be highlighted is the role that the Khmer community must play in the advocacy effort in order to bring effective, meaningful change to Cambodia. To help us in this process, Seyla Nhean will be explaining what the Khmer community has been doing, their new initiatives, and new efforts that will give the Khmer community a more effective voice and role.
2 years ago, when the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia's initiative was getting started, Brad Adams, then serving as Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, convened and led what he called an information sharing and strategic planning discussion with a wide variety of Khmer groups and leaders. The key point that Brad Adams made, and that emerged as the most important conclusion of that session, was that meaningful and effective progress on Cambodia's long-standing and far-ranging human rights and rule of law problems could not be made. That Hun Sen's autocratic and highly repressive systems would continue in place unless the Khmer community became a stronger voice and a more active and effective advocate for meaningful reform at the international level. Shortly after, the United Nations, in strong and crystal clear language that was highly unusual for the UN, made very similar findings. A half dozen UN officials and agencies at the highest level issued a series of reports and statements indicating, in the strongest terms, that the scheduled national elections of 2023 could not be considered or treated as fair, free, or legitimate unless major reforms that the UN identified in very specific terms were implemented by the Hun Sen government that would meaningfully reduce the human rights and democracy abuses that were taking place throughout civil society on a thorough-going basis. Perhaps because of two important messages, something happened in April to suggest that the Khmer community understood that if meaningful and effective change was to take place in Cambodia, if the Khmer people were to be able to exercise their vote and participate in the political and electoral process in a free and fair way, they had to take up Brad Adams and the United Nations challenge and find new and more effective ways to challenge Hun Sen's abusive and authoritarian policies on the world stage. In Lowell, Massachusetts, the Khmer community organized a massive and successful protest against a city mayor's proposal to connect Lowell with a Cambodian sister city in a sister city agreement that would have given a de facto recognition and support to Hun Sen's authoritarian control of Cambodia's political process and the predetermined elections. That was one of several new advocacy efforts that the Khmer community initiated to make their voice heard more forcefully to challenge Hun Sen's human rights abuses and his authoritarian control over the national elections, so as to remain in power indefinitely by eliminating the political opposition, putting critics and independent journalists in jail, and making it impossible for members of civil society to exercise their free speech and free assembly rights. A new initiative was started called the Khmer Urgent Action Case Alert System that uses the Amnesty International's model to provide Khmer community members a way to protest the mass criminal trials and other arrests and criminal persecutions that Hun Sen has been using on an increasing basis to silence and punish his critics and other political opposition leaders. Now, for the first time, individual members of the Khmer community have a simple means available to them to express their views in support of victims of abuse and prisoners of conscience. The Kemsaka case is the perfect symbolic model of how the Khmer community can use the newly formed Khmer Urgent Action Case Alert System to give its members an effective way and voice for speaking out in defense and in support of victims of the most egregious forms of abuse and persecution. Several months ago, Kemsaka received a 27-year criminal sentence, essentially ending his political career for doing no more than offering a political alternative to Hun Sen. The Urgent Action Case Alert System gives members of the Khmer community a simple and direct way to challenge this atrocity of justice and to come to Kemsaka's assistance. In addition, through the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia and other advocacy groups, the Khmer community, one, organized a grassroots monitoring effort to assess whether the United Nations Action Plan of Reform was being implemented, and two, developed an action and advocacy plan that identified a number of specific strategies for changing the legitimacy of Hun Sen's predetermined elections and other human rights violations and abuses. These include calling for suspension of the rigged national elections unless and until positive movement to implement the reform measures that the United Nations specifically proposed could be established. Boycotting the elections until the UN and the international community can certify them as free and fair, imposing a trade and tourism boycott on Cambodia, and imposing other forms of economic sanctions on key companies and Cambodian officials benefiting from the Hun Sen's abusive policies, and increasing the Khmer community's voice and advocacy presence with the key United Nations, EU agencies, and foreign governments dealing with Cambodia, starting with the United Nations Human Rights Council's Universal Periodic Compliance Review session on Cambodia, scheduled for April of 2024. With these new tools and plans in place, and with the stronger and clearer support being provided by the United Nations, the Khmer community, as the very positive experience in Lowell has demonstrated, now has the ability to make its voice heard in important new ways on the international stage. Will this be enough to produce the meaningful and effective change that Brad Adams' strategic planning meeting called for 2 years ago? Not by itself. Meaningful progress against major and long-lasting human rights and authoritarian abuses of the kind that Hun Sen has been imposing cannot be achieved overnight or by one single advocacy effort. There is no single magic bullet that can cure major abuses. What it takes to make meaningful progress and produce effective change is the type of coordinated, sustained advocacy efforts that puts pressure on the Hun Sen government in a more meaningful way. The United Nations Action Plan of Reform Measures, along with their strongly worded and high-level series of reports and statements on Cambodia, is a hugely important first step in that direction. So are the new sets of advocacy initiatives that the Khmer community has undertaken. The Khmer community understands the sad reality that Hun Sen has solidified his authoritarian power by thoroughly taking control of the political process and by closing down any and all competing voices in civil society. That is the bad news. But the good news is that with the United Nations finally speaking out forcefully and clearly to challenge Hun Sen's abuses and his false claims of free elections, the Khmer community has new partners and new opportunities for seeking change. Together with the new Urgent Action Network and the agenda of advocacy actions to achieve positive reform, the Khmer community now has a new set of tools and opportunities that can help to bring effective and meaningful change within reach. Let's be sure to use these new tools and opportunities to make a difference. Let's carry through in a sustained and effective way with the plan for advocacy actions that has been adopted. A strong indicator that these new tools and opportunities are working and can produce meaningful change is that Hun Sen himself responded directly to the community after its call that the election be boycotted based on UN findings. This indicates that the new path that we are taking is working and that we can make an effective difference. If we are to truly make a meaningful and effective difference and help produce meaningful change in Cambodia, we must build on these beginnings and carry through with these new advocacy initiatives in a forceful, sustained, and coordinated way with the United Nations and other advocacy partners, starting with the United Nations April 2024 Compliance Review of Cambodia. We need to use every voice, every opportunity, every forum available to us to challenge Hun Sen's abuses and develop the international partnerships and supports that can help us demand the type of meaningful and effective change that Brad Adams set us on a path towards 2 years ago.
This brings us to the conclusion of the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia's special session dealing with the July 23rd national elections. The point and purpose of this special session on the elections was to explain why the United Nations has rejected the results of that election as illegitimate because Hun Sen's long-standing and systematic human rights and rule of law abuses make free and fair elections totally impossible. But this leaves unanswered the very critical question of what needs to be done about the sad state of affairs in Cambodia. How do we deal with the sad reality that Hun Sen has doubled down on his abuses to eliminate any meaningful political opposition, and to consolidate his autocratic power, and to make it permanent by passing it on to his son, Hun Manet? What steps can we take facing these sad and seemingly interactable realities of Hun Sen's dictatorial control? What steps can we and should we be taking to help bring a reasonable degree of improved human rights, rule of law, and democracy to Cambodia and to the Khmer people. The Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia believes that it can help answer these critical questions. So it scheduled a second special session focused on these important matters on September 23, 2023. The reason this date was chosen is that it coincides with the date that the United Nations begins its official human rights review for Cambodia, that it calls the Universal Periodic Review, UPR, process. That signifies that more needs to be done regarding Cambodia and invites us to be part of that process by submitting complaints and comments by the September 23rd start date. So, the first action step that we must take to deal more effectively with the Hun Sen regime and its abuses also begins for us on that date. In addition to making a formal written submission to the United Nations on that date, as they have requested, Brad Adams, former Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, and Paul Hoffman, one of the chairman's 2 commissioners, will convene the second part of our special coverage and treatment of the Cambodia election issues. This session will focus on finding the answers to the critical question of where do we go from here, and identifying the steps we can and must take to help produce meaningful and effective change for Cambodia. Please also note that on November 1st, there will be a special strategic planning session with a panel of international experts to help us identify and explore what effective advocacy action for Cambodia should include. We encourage the Khmer community to sign up to attend this Zoom webinar session. We hope that this session will provide some of the clear and specific answers that you're looking for regarding what advocacy and action steps can be taken to help make a meaningful difference for Cambodia. As the United Nations has made clear, we cannot accept the manufactured, predetermined results of the Cambodian elections, coronating Hun Sen's and Hun Manet's rule as legitimate. We must find effective ways of challenging those results and of bringing greater human right, rule of law, and democracy to Cambodia. Join us at our next special session on September 23rd with this purpose in mind, and as a first step towards the additional advocacy and action steps that are required.